Hi there. China's reform and opening up have promoted the country's economic growth for the past 40 years. What are the driving forces behind the prosperity, and how does Chinese culture impact the rise of entrepreneurship, and how do traditional values of hard work and diligence help shape the civil society today? To discuss these issues and more, I'm very happy to be joined in the studio by Professor Teng Jimeng from Beijing Foreign Studies University and Professor David Moser from Yancheng Academy of Peking University. And via satellite, we're going to talk to Joanna Lei Chen, who is a former Taiwan legislator in Taipei, and Steve Kulik, Director of the Intercultural Institute of Shanghai International Studies University. That's our topic. This is a dialogue. I'm Yang Rui. 岛语写太差了，一直没改。 Well, gentlemen, you know, in the Beijing studio here, gentlemen, China will commemorate the 40th anniversary of its opening up this year, and President Xi Jinping is expected to deliver a policy speech towards the end of this year to commemorate the opening up. Now, when we review the China story, what are the points you consider very important for a proper understanding of the new realities in this country?
I think the first point that comes to my mind is the vitality of the Chinese culture, the resilience on the part of the population, especially on the part of the Chinese entrepreneur, this new entrepreneurial class who strive to achieve this very miraculous growth in Chinese economy. And lastly, I think it is also about the rise of China almost at all levels, both in terms of the economic and also the political as well as the diplomatic. And lastly, I think in terms of the general quality of the population. And lastly, materially, for example, China has been so successful in lifting hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, and that I consider is a major contribution to the world.
At the cost of the environmental conditions. But David, what are your thoughts?
I think that we're entering a new era. The reform on opening up, as we know, started out with Deng Xiaoping. That one of his many slogans was that China should hide its light and bide its time. And I think that era is over with. It's now it's time for China to be more aggressive on the world stage, which it is. I think that the poverty alleviation is one of the greatest stories that China has to offer, and the economic development goes without saying. But China now has to take its place geopolitically and cooperate and be more active in the world community, which it also is. But this is fraught with a lot of difficulties. So it's a new era. China is much stronger, but there's a lot of risk for friction and geopolitical engagement. But
I'm afraid our global expansion has been viewed by Western media, particularly those in the United States, as aggressive, assertive, and therefore the image of China seems to be more like a threat, the biggest threat strategically to the United States, surpassing Russia and ISIL, according to the U.S. government. Now, I'd like to have Joanna's perception about whether the image of China has been discredited or demonized by American media, and increasingly so.
Well, certainly there has been a mammoth change in China. Therefore, in terms of scale, scope, and speed, it's all unprecedented. So if you look at China's 40 years of history, there are three major characteristics. One, massive transformation in economic, social, political, and cultural lives. Second, massive adaptation to not only new way of life, but also new technology, and therefore it's almost leading the advancement of new technology. And the third one, certainly, there are displacement. There are people who are lagging behind. You have laggards. So the displacement caused a lot of concerns internationally in terms of their rights and also human rights issues. So transformation, adaptation, and displacement are all three in one during a period of unprecedented growth in scale, in scope, and in speed.
Yes, indeed. The urbanization has really been inspired by massive migration. Migrant workers in their millions flock to the more prosperous urban areas and make their due contributions to the change of the skylines. Let me cross over to Steve Kulik, an expert of cultural studies in Shanghai International Studies University. Hi, Steve. You are an expert of cultural studies. From your perspective, what do you think of the behavior of Chinese consumers and entrepreneurs who have worked together successfully to change the landscape of the Chinese economy over the past 4 decades? Steve?
Good. Well, I do agree with each of the points just made, but as you know, I'm not a specialist in economics. But looking at China culturally, I think it's quite phenomenal that the China that we studied and China studies around the world, considering it to be a latent, lagging Confucian giant and stuck in feudal patterns, has actually been able to engineer this transformation. It could be because the starting point was just so devastated after those years of World War II and the occupation period and the start of the liberation and various campaigns that, and then hitting natural disasters, and of course then the 10 difficult years in the 60s and 70s with the Great Cultural Revolution. But that out of that a pragmatism could come and a resolve to begin to develop Chinese society at an economic level, but to mobilize people's sense of hope so that literally everyone in the country, even children, would be working hard at school and trying to basically move ahead in cultural studies and especially in intercultural communication from a values perspective. This achievement motivation and this desire to self-sacrifice for each other to build the next circle of family, the next circle of community, and eventually build the nation, I just find very dramatic and very impressive.
Yes, the process of modernization is actually one of nation-making over the past 4 decades. A second look at traditional Chinese culture, we may come up with the idea about soft power. However, many American and Chinese observers ask much the same question as to which comes across as the most important, communist leadership or Confucianism. Outside China, we have so many schools and colleges of Confucianist studies, but in China, communist leadership is viewed as the most important in ensuring economic and social transformation. Joanna, I'd like to have your thoughts, because a voice from Taiwan would sound more convincing for a skeptical audience in the West, right?
Well, certainly I think if you look at the history, Confucianism and the virtues taught by Confucius will be in our blood. So that's something that you carry with you. However, the most recent development has a lot to do with the planned economy and the planned nature of the economic growth in mainland China. And from a totally planned economy to a gradual easing into a market-related economy, there are a lot of things that needs to be done in proper planning and proper steps. So during those times, people have to suffer to an extent, and they have to understand sometimes personal sacrifices will be for the huge greater good for the all. So I think both contributed to China's current miraculous growth in economic ways, but also it has a lot to contribute in terms of social adaptation and building new social norms, which is a process just beginning.
Jimeng, we are talking about soft power. Well, a little bit controversial as to whether we should focus on economics or politics. But when it comes to the image of China, what do you think of what happened quite a few years ago when the Time magazine elected a group of Chinese workers in Shenzhen as People of the Year? And we are talking about, diligence and resilience of both the Chinese individuals and Chinese culture. Jimeng.
Well, once again, the quintessential Chineseness in terms of this very soft power is industry, hardworking, resilience, the very kind of success and achievement-driven sort of story that have been motivating generations and generations of people from, since the founding of this very republic, or if we can date back to the dynasties 2,000 years ago. And so in this sense, I think that this soft power, if it is used positively, I think it can be very, very positive and inspirational.
What are the core values concerning the soft power?
Right. on two levels. For example, at the micro level, I think this very core value stresses the importance of being hardworking, being very resilient, and being kind of successful in career, and filial piety in terms of family life, and also loyalty to your bosses, for example, at the workplace. At a micro level, I think this hierarchy, China actually relies on this very Confucian hierarchy to keep stability, social stability and political stability at all levels.
Do you agree, David?
I think there's a problem with China's soft power in a certain way. I understand, the need for it, and the Chinese government is certainly spending a lot of money on it, including on your show and this whole operation. But you notice the Chinese soft power, and we're talking about Confucius here, still tends to reside in the past. It's the legacy of China. There's a renewed interest in Chinese philosophy, for example. There's an interest in the Confucius Institutes promote Chinese traditional culture. The sort of soft power that you see in South Korea, the United States, etc., is a kind of a newer phenomenon that has greater economic implications. And I think that the problem is soft power is not a top-down dictated phenomenon. It's not something you can throw billions of dollars at and produce something that will catch on worldwide. It's a bottom-up process. So I think China has to work very hard in its education, in filmmaking,
popular culture,
field, to free up the expressive power of the people who do these, the creative artists who do this, and also the entrepreneurs who are able to do. And in both of those ways, the entrepreneurs have been squelched by a lack of access to loans, and the creative forces have been squelched, not necessarily by something objective, but the fact that they've been forced into a sort of a framework that the government wants to impose on them as a soft power. And I think that's a mistake. They've got to let these forces...
Well, if I can disagree, David, I think that in filmmaking, the government actually had been allocating lots of funding for young and even including independent directors right now currently. There's always this bonus and funding available to these young filmmakers. Look at these film festivals at Filmart, where people were talking about film deals right now. And so I think it's improving. And I mean, other than the entrepreneurs at the township enterprises, they might have trouble.
Other than the boom of the showbiz and the movie industry in China, let me cross over to Joanna again. Now, we have such a big army of the middle-class consumers in increasingly market-oriented economy. But it's a controversial because Vice President Mike Pence says that China is not a market economy as they have expected China to be since our entry into the WTO in the year 2003, and therefore the issue of a poison pill, a critical issue in the United States, Mexico and Canada agreement on their free trade. So what do you think of the sense of justice and rule of law and their importance for the growth of a middle-income class in China, and do they actually represent the future and the strength of the country? Sorry, Joanna. Yeah. Obviously, there's something wrong with the communication with technically with Joanna. We can't hear her clearly. Now, Steve, what do you think of the sense of justice for this country? It could be an important part of the image of China, right? And people start to develop a sense about decency, justice, through education and rule of law, for example, to pursue a fair play. We're not talking about level playing field of the market economy, but rather in a general sense. What do you think of, the wake-up call of rule of law?
Well, I think we have to realize that each country, each national system, each cultural group has certain values by which it's operated. And we've just talked about the role of Confucianism, which certainly is an echo that continues to influence China. But, if we try to overemphasize Confucianism, I think we take out some of just the sense of what Confucianism and the cultural patterns passed on in terms of a deep commitment to individuals supporting families and being connected. You know, we sometimes talk about the negative aspects of guanxi, but actually guanxi is a kind of social support system. You know who you're connected to, you know who can help you, and there is a sense of decency in that. In shifting to rule of law, of course, this means making sure that we have pen and paper to document black and white what laws will be you know, authorized, how things will be carried out, what will be prosecuted, and so on. And I think that shift is going on. There is still, however, the flexibility in relationships and ways of dealing with things that shows a human decency to one another, especially those in the in-group. And as in-group works with in-group, things tend to balance themselves out. So I think it's a gradual transition. I think it's, in the time that we've been here, we've seen a much better policed Shanghai, and a lot more traffic control and people following rules and laws. So I think back to what several mentioned earlier in the program, that this sense of adaptability, this sense of being able to find a way to adjust and fit into the new world order, as it were, is moving along fairly well. Of course, there's areas that need to be informed. People need to grow in patterns. Any cultural pattern takes time to change. But I sense there's a lot more sense of commitment that we want a well-ordered China, and one that functions so that we all can continue to have economic prosperity and growth.
Despite the embarrassing issue of left behind the children in their thousands in the underdeveloped rural areas, migrant workers have made enormous contributions to the success of the Chinese economy. So, Joanna, what do you think of the success of their integration into the urban life, and the education of their kids in major cities is of course of paramount importance. But other than this, do you think they are likely to be part of the middle class if they are treated very well instead of being called 低端人口?
Well, if you look at the so-called soft power you talked about earlier, there are two new soft powers that's very rampant in China. You see it everywhere. One is the power of innovation, and the other is the strive for upward social mobility. So it is understandable that parents would like their kids to be in better places or better schools, like in everywhere. But I think China has tackled the growth issue in the last 40 years, and now is really tackling the distribution issues, such as the new towns system for the 特色小镇. They are going to build very fantastic rural systems so that people do not have to be displaced. They don't really have to migrate in order to have better education, better medical care for their elderly and for their children. If China can successfully move the next ladder by distributing school systems, medical systems, basic supplies of growth in rural areas, then we can have an easing of those migrant situations. But however, no matter where you look, people have a drive for upward mobility. They want better lives for themselves, and they want better lives for their children.
Thank you so much, Joanna. Jimeng, a recent news event went viral on the internet concerning a spat between Cui Yongyuan and Feng Xiaogang, the most renowned movie director. It's actually about the yin-yang contract, namely the visible and invisible incomes for the show people, I mean actors and actors. This somehow reflected a clear awareness of the middle class about the income disparity, about justice that might be done through punishment to sort of avoid tax evasion.
Well, once again, that issue highlights one of the most pressing problems in China nowadays. I think that the divide in between the rich and the poor, law and justice and fairness. In Fan Bingbing's case, once again, I think that she violates the law. That's the first thing. That's the first thing first. I mean, she got to be punished. And at the same time, I think that we need to examine our distribution system. The wealth distribution system, once again, is now the core issue that facing this very nation, the challenge of this very nation, which has been growing and being transformed into the second world economy in this sense. And so I think that the government is now taking measures, the cracking down on this very phenomenon, the so-called yin and yang contract, and also, I mean, in general, corruption. has been on a top priority on the government agenda. In this sense, I'm hoping for the best. I'm hoping for justice be brought about and be brought to those who violate the law, and also decency and respect brought to those who works very hard, like these Shenzhen migrant workers working on the construction sites.
When we look at the future, that should be shared by 人类命运共同体, okay? That's what President Xi Jinping said, community of shared future. So, what does it take for China to assume leadership? The United States says, no, you should not steal the spotlight. You should not be so close to the center states that I have dominated since the end of the Second World War. However, no nation would feel comfortable with always being the second fiddler in the orchestra. David Moser, what does it take for China to be accepted by most of the world, or the rest of the world, so that in terms of soft power and sharp power, economic strength, culturally, in all aspects, do you think, I mean, it's a remote goal. How far is it for China to catch up?
Well, in some sense, the goal got a little nearer and less remote when Donald Trump came into power and disengaged, that's one of your Ds, disengaged from the world economy and the neoliberal sort of globalism. China does stand in a very good spot right now. There's many areas where it can take the leading role. There's many areas where it should have had the leading role in the past and is now finally able to actually do something about it. But don't forget that China is not isolated from these sort of reactions against the globalism and the neoliberal order that Trump and Brexit saw. China has the same, as Professor Teng just said, income inequality, lots of popular dissatisfaction, a feeling that the system is rigged against them. China has these same complaints and these same problems. So if China is going to go forward, it needs to solve these domestic problems. Otherwise, it remains too fragile. China can't be spending so much of its money on domestic tranquility, domestic stability maintenance.
Exactly. First and foremost, we have to do more to level the playing field for the private economy and the SOE. Now, having said this, let me cross over to Steve. What does it take for China to be more accepted, to sound more convincing when the United States seeks to discredit our story about the economic expansion?
Well, I'll echo what has been said earlier. David mentioned it, and so did the other speakers, about if we focus too much on an orchestrated soft power, a kind of centralized, we're going to see what we can do to control things and have the best image possible, then I think that does create a certain sense of either distrust or skepticism. But when we have the people-to-people level interactions, when various social groups are involved with others and real people meet real people across borders, when there's social engagement, when citizens realize that the income disparity in their neighborhood is not good, or that sunlight rights have been taken by some new buildings going up, and people actually find ways to use WeChat or whatever to begin to try to communicate a message and bring about these kinds of new levels of justice to the street, and the disparities that Joanna mentioned and others have mentioned too. I think these are the issues that have to be faced, that the goodwill of realizing that a much better educated populace is connected to the world, is communicating with the world, people are studying abroad, people are returning, people are investing, and through these actions, the kind of Chinese human-heartedness, the Ren that Confucius emphasized, and people's sense of renqing wer, this kind of care for other people, I think that decency will come through. So I really encourage a lot more of this kind of interaction at all levels, because I think that's what's making a difference in people's perception of China.
Let me go to Joanna. Hi, Joanna. What are the challenges lying ahead for China to build a very nice image, not just the Kung Fu Panda in the eyes of Hollywood, or Bruce Lee, the Kung Fu superstar, or Zhang Ziyi, the prize-winning actress, or Confucius, perhaps iconic image about Chinese culture. So what does it take for China to convince the rest of the world that we are not a threat? We are ready to help. We are ready to provide public service and public products.
Well, certainly I'm a believer of the power of communication. Programs like this provides a real forum for dialogue in which value is exchanged. I think China needs to engage, especially the United States, in a power and value dialogue. It's not just economic power, but also what the value China may bring to the world stage. For example, the One Belt, One Road, China is trying to build a commonwealth in which not only economic growth is shared, but also humanity will be celebrated. And that kind of dialogue is critically important. And another thing I think would be helpful is to promote NPO and NGO exchanges. China has a rising volunteerism. I met young volunteers who gave their lives in rural areas serving underprivileged populations. These stories will serve to tell people that China is not just from a planned economy to a group of people who only chase their own wealth, but it also cultivated volunteerism, cultivated celebration of humanity, cultivated the sharing of the commonwealth being built through a rising China economy.
Joanna, we've been discussing the issue of unification or sharing the same future across the Taiwan Strait on many occasions on this program. Today, with the DPP to win the local elections in most probability, the mainland seems pretty calm and composed. We have done a lot more to appeal to the mind and heart of the younger generation. Unless we are able to engage the younger generation in Taiwan, we won't be able to achieve a real unification. In that sense, what do you think of the future across the Taiwan Strait? Because Mr. Xi Jinping says in many of his policy speeches in the understatement that unless we can achieve unification peacefully, China would not 由大变强 from a big power to a strong power.
To be a strong power, you must be accepted by people accepting your strength. So I fully understand why Mr. Xi Jinping said such a statement. I think if you look at people from mainland China migrated to Taiwan 400 years ago, they came to Taiwan for education, for business opportunities, and sometimes just to escape starvation. Now, lots of young Taiwanese students, young people, who are doing the reverse. They went to mainland China for education, for business opportunity, and some of them become NPO, NGO volunteers, serving their hearts and souls to the underprivileged populations. And this kind of exchanges will do a lot than politicians and all the debates that we have in the major forums, because this is where the true feelings and true love, true identity is shared. So I'm still hopeful, Yang Rui.
Yeah, we keep our fingers crossed for a unified future, a collective future across the Taiwan Strait. Towards the end of our very enlightening program about China's image and soft power, competitive edge, what do you have to say to let, those who are skeptical about the Chinese strategy and economic expansion, let them know that China will not be a threat?
Well, once again, I think Confucius and Confucianism will have an immense role to play. In this sense, I'd like to evoke the very concept of self-driven development. That's not supposed to be independent and insulated from the rest of the community. I think it's all about things naturally formed, coexisting and co-developing with the rest of the world. China is for globalization. China will be in the rest of the world.
But I'm afraid the word Dr. Henry Kissinger stands for co-evolution between the two biggest economies may not be accepted by Trump and his team in the White House. Next time we're going to continue to discuss this. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.